We're delighted to have Andy Bacevich with us this evening to talk about his new book, The Age of Illusions, How America Squandered Its Cold War Victory. Just from that subtitle, you can quickly tell what anyone who knows Andy knows about him, which is that he doesn't mince words. Over the years, he's emerged as one of the most vocal and incisive critics of American foreign and military policy, and his background as both an experienced soldier and distinguished scholar has given his views added authority. A graduate of both the U.S. Military Academy and Princeton, where he earned a PhD in history, Andy served in the U.S. Army for 23 years, including time in Vietnam during the war, rising to the rank of colonel and then moving on to civilian life, where he ended up teaching history and international relations as a professor at Boston University. In his earlier works, I think there's been something like 9 of them. Andy has talked about some of them before here in PNP. Those earlier books have addressed Andy's concerns about America's over-reliance on military power in foreign affairs and its failure to do more diplomatically. He's excoriated not only U.S. involvement in the Iraq War, but what he sees as decades of misuse of American power throughout the Middle East. And he has assigned blame across the board to Democrats as well as Republicans for pursuing policies not in the national interest. With characteristic bluntness, as recently as a few months ago, he was quoted declaring, quote, "The foreign policy establishment is brain dead." That quote came in an interview about Andy's role in helping to establish a sort of action-oriented think tank here in D.C. intended to promote reason, restraint, and prudence in the use of force and move U.S. policy toward more diplomatic approaches. Called the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft, the think tank is nonpartisan and founded with contributions from both George Soros and Charles Koch. How often do you see those two get together? And it's intended to foster alliances among progressives and conservatives. In the Age of Illusions, Andy returns to a number of his favorite themes, recounting how the United States, since the end of the Cold War nearly 3 decades ago, has managed to squander many of the advantages of its victory over the Soviet Union. Our nation's engagement in prolonged conflicts, its embrace of economic globalization, and its emphasis on individual autonomy over self-discipline and social obligation have led not so much to world peace and prosperity, Andy argues, but to inequality, divisiveness, and of course, Donald Trump. This is not a particularly encouraging message with which to start the new year, but it is a very thoughtful and sobering one, and Andy writes lucidly and passionately and offers in the end a bracing vision of a positive way forward. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Andy Bacevich.
Well, I'm grateful for the kind introduction. I'm grateful to you all for turning out this evening. This is, in fact, my second book talk on this book. The publication date was yesterday. The first book talk was in New York City. I don't want to put any pressure on you. Well, we sold 35 books last night. See if you can rise to the occasion. So I'll speak briefly. And then we'll have a Q&A with no restrictions. That is to say, if you'd like to discuss what it was like growing up in Indiana back in the 1950s, I'm willing to do that. If you want to talk about why, despite everything, I remain a Catholic, I'm willing to go there. If you want to talk about whether or not Tom Brady is going to stick with the Patriots, we can do that well. Only 3 topics off limits. The assassination of General Soleimani, U.S.-Iranian relations, and Donald Trump. Besides that, we can talk about anything you want to. Obviously, that's a joke. So, there are, I believe, multiple ways of approaching my book. And let me say plainly that I very much hope you will read my book and maybe even consider buying it. From one point of view, it's my explanation of how we got Trump. But from another point of view, I intend this book to be a history, a concise narrative of the post-Cold War era. That's a phrase that recurs throughout the book, referring to the roughly quarter century from the fall of the Berlin Wall in October of 1989 and the election of November 2016. Now, we know the several wars beforehand as the Cold War. The period that began with the election of Donald Trump has not yet acquired an agreed-upon name, although I will say that I am quite confident that it will not be known as the Age of Trump. But my focus in this book is on what came between, the sequence of events that took the nation from a moment of ostensibly unprecedented triumph, when the future seemed ours to define, to a moment when a profoundly divided electorate installed as president someone, in my estimation, manifestly ill-equipped for the office. Now, mine is necessarily a provisional account. Future historians will provide their own interpretation of this post-Cold War era, no doubt going on at far greater length than I have in the Age of Illusions. So if you want a 600-page doorstop version of the period, you just need to wait a few years. But today, I'm trying to provide the essence of the story, and to do so in just a bit more than 200 pages. The overarching theme of the story that I tell is hubris. What happens when an arrogant policy elite suddenly fancies itself relieved of all constraints and called upon to define the future of humankind? That, I think, describes the immediate response to the fall of the Berlin Wall, particularly in this city. Indeed, with perfect timing, the scholar Francis Fukuyama captured the mood of the moment when he published an essay in 1989 called The End of History. Now, the editor of the journal in which that essay appeared inserted a question mark after history, as if Fukuyama were posing a question. In fact, an exclamation point would have been far more appropriate, as members of the policy world quickly leaped to the conclusion that the end of the Cold War signified something profound, with the field now open for the United States to define the history that would follow the end of history. America had won the Cold War, and the United States was now in a position to determine what would come next, not only for Americans, but for the planet as a whole. Now, note the dubious and indeed dangerous assumptions embedded in those last two sentences. The first is the notion that the Cold War itself defined the essence of global history in the latter half of the 20th century, with all other matters, all other developments relegated to the status of afterthought. And the second dubious assumption was that we had indeed won, triumphed, prevailed, vanquished the adversary, and that we were therefore in a position to reap the rewards. Now, with the benefit of hindsight, I've come to believe that the Cold War was not a contest to be won so much as to be endured. It was a vast and arguably unnecessary tragedy, which the United States managed to survive. And the proper response to the end of the Cold War, I've come to believe, was not celebration, but repentance. But that's not the interpretation that prevailed back when the Berlin Wall went down. Now let us acknowledge that Americans have had an affinity for hubris that predates the passing of the Cold War by several centuries. The conviction that it is incumbent upon America to determine the course of history has a long pedigree, dating at least as far back as John Winthrop's famous sermon of 1630, when he charged his doughty band of followers with establishing what he called a city upon a hill destined to illuminate the entire globe. And all of that came roaring back after 1989, when it appeared that no obstacles remained to prevent the United States from completing its providentially assigned saving mission. Pursuant to that mission, 4 big ideas emerged to form the basis of U.S. policy in the wake of the Cold War. I'm hesitant to spoil the story for you, but here are those 4 ideas. First, a belief in the capacity of corporate capitalism operating on a global scale to create unprecedented wealth in which all would share. The one-word name for this was globalization. Second, a belief in American military supremacy, thought to be beyond challenge, with the military power to be used as an instrument enabling the indispensable nation, another post-Cold War phrase, enabling the indispensable nation to keep order and spread American values. Third, a belief in a radically expanded conception of individual freedom unmoored from traditional norms. This new definition of freedom was heavy on rights and privileges, and notably light on duties and obligations. Fourth, a belief that history had charged the President of the United States with serving as the great helmsman who would preside over all that was to come next, with the White House itself now GHQ of the entire universe. All 4 of these were laced with a faith in the transformative effects of information technology. God might be dead, but we had Steve Jobs, Bill Gates, Mark Zuckerberg, and Google to fill the void left by his departure. It fell to the 3 presidents of the post-Cold War era, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama, to translate these ideas into actual policy. I don't mean to suggest that those 3 presidents subscribed to an identical worldview. I do mean to say that all 3 found themselves called upon to fulfill the expectations that policy intellectuals had foisted onto an unsuspecting public. With what results? Well, I don't want to give away the entire story, but let me just say that we ought to see the election of 2016 as a referendum on that post-Cold War agenda. In sufficient numbers to install Donald Trump in the White House, voters, their numbers effectively augmented by citizens who couldn't even bother to vote, but voters said no to the economic disparities stemming from globalization. Voters said no to the endless wars resulting from the misuse of American military power and the abuse of American soldiers. And voters said no to the alienation and anomie that were byproducts of discarding traditional moral norms. And so they handed power to a mountebank who promised to make America great again. Now, we can argue about the myriad factors contributing to Hillary Clinton's defeat, to include her own manifest failings. But the outcome of the election represented a decisive repudiation of the core components that comprised the post-Cold War consensus. And the anger expressed daily by columnists in the New York Times or hosts on MSNBC testifies to a continuing refusal to acknowledge that repudiation. Trump's election instantly plunged the United States into a political crisis that will not end until he leaves office. Indeed, my expectation is that the crisis will persist after he departs office, simply because few members of our political establishment are willing to own up to why he became president in the first place. In other words, Trump is not cause, but consequence of that crisis. He won because the propositions expected to define history after the end of history failed egregiously. And the beginning of wisdom lies in facing up to that central truth. Only then will it be possible to take on the difficult task of healing our divisions and charting a path forward, a path based on reality rather than on a fanciful misreading of history's actual intentions, which will remain hidden, as always. Thank you very much. So I believe now the routine is for people who would like to pose a question to come up to one of the two mics that are on each side of this gathering. So please. And we want to have gender balance. All right? I am not a diversity guy, but we want to have gender balance, so we have to take turns, right? Male, female. But
sounds good. You like me first?
and as always, it will be a male that goes to the mic first.
Yeah, I know. My name is Thomas, U.S. Army, 2006 to 2015. I went to Afghanistan, and I guess I'll just pitch this one out. You know, you coming from academia, what's your take on the way that information warfare, the way that information is in communication happens today, in the sense that social media and the internet has really destroyed a lot of the gatekeeping on those New York Times columnists you mentioned and other establishment media, and whether you perceive that as more of a good thing or more of a chaos type thing?
I think I was prepared for any question you would ask, but not this one. I don't own a smartphone. I am not on social media. I don't tweet, etc., etc. I actually largely view those things as the work of the devil. I recognize the fact that if I'm driving down a highway, it's great to have some GPS apparatus tell me how to get where I want to go. But I must say that on balance, it appears to me that the overall effects of the information revolution, maybe I mean the overall effects in a moral sense, are negative. And I know I'm not the only one, but it troubles me deeply. You know, when I go to the IHOP and watch a family of four sitting around overindulging on pancakes, that every member of the family of four is sitting at the table looking at their phone and ignoring everybody else. There is something deeply, deeply troubling, subversive, wrong in the way we have allowed this information technology to take over our lives. And let me not pose as some kind of a great innocent, because I probably spend 5 or 6 hours a day looking at my laptop and you know, accessing the internet in one way or the other. But your question focused more on war.
Yes. Well, it kind of comes from the idea, I forget where I heard it, but there was comments on towards the end of the Soviet Union. One of the destabilizing effects was the infusion of more information and a different narrative, basically, than what came from the Kremlin. And I feel like we have that today, where we have countless competing realities, which was a phrase from one of the DIA assessments from a few years ago. And that at least the establishment narratives, the foreign policy, the brain dead blob you talk about, like their narratives have just been given as rote, and it got us into the Iraq War, and it's got us into wars since. But now there's some competition in that space, even though it's very chaotic.
Well, I think you're onto something. And yet I'd probably push back a little bit to suggest that even before the internet, there were competing narratives. Sure. There was disagreement about what defined truth. And there was consciously and maliciously injected into the public discourse falsehoods, lies. So I suppose it's true that information technology makes that phenomenon more pervasive, more difficult to control, but I don't think it's all that new, actually. Next, please.
Thank you for your concise and insightful lecture. Much of the hubris and arrogance that you describe could come under the more benign topic of so-called American exceptionalism. My question is, having had this been rejected, going forward, are there any benign aspects of American exceptionalism that may come to the fore and have a role in the future?
Why do you, and I'm not throwing this back, but why do you believe American exceptionalism deserves to be called benign?
I'm just saying that it doesn't use the same term. It's just sort of a nicer, softer term, a more benign sounding term.
Oh, okay.
That's all I meant.
Well, it is benign sounding, but I would argue strongly that it ain't benign. I mean, American exceptionalism, what does that mean? What does that phrase mean? It means we're chosen. We are, by God, by providence, by history, we are chosen. And we are chosen, and I'm stating it crudely now, but we are chosen to transform the world in our image. American exceptionalism, rooted in the notion of American exceptionalism, is that they out there should live like we live. That they out there should embrace a conception of freedom that is identical to our conception of freedom. And what's really especially interesting is that when our conception of freedom changes, well, god dang it, they're supposed to get with the program. Our conception of freedom, to take just one example, our conception of freedom until a decade or so ago said that there was a definition of marriage, that it was a union between one man and one woman. We came to the conclusion that that was too narrow and indeed was unfair. And now, by golly, we expect, Afghans and Iraqis and whoever else to recognize that their definition of freedom should embrace that sort of notion. So this is deeply insidious, and I think there's an element of I'm struggling for the word now, but of intolerance that is part of the way American exceptionalism works in our politics. So I am against it. Except perhaps if one defines American exceptionalism as something that should be manifested with the United States simply functioning as an exemplar. If American exceptionalism would mean that the way we organize our society and our lives was going to demonstrate our belief in a set of values, in the hopes that others may someday come to see value in those things, then I'd say okay. But the truth is, our history is one in which we're going to shove our values down their throat more often than not at the point of a sword. And that's not something that simply has happened, since 9/11. It has happened since 9/11, but it happened in earlier times in our history.
Thank you.
A different question, sir. I'd like to ask you about the Cold War itself, which is really, in many ways, also the topic of your book. Has your view of the Cold War
Big time.
Could you say a little bit about that, please? I would like to hear. I know you wrote a book, American Empire, right?
I did.
Yes.
Yeah.
And there was some very interesting stuff there. I think things have evolved. If you could speak to that, sir, I would very much like to hear that.
So this is a question that invites a biographical answer, and I won't go to the part about growing up in Indiana. But I spent the first half of my professional life as a soldier.
Yeah.
And the education that I received in Indiana and at the military academy was one that formed me in a way that I was a relatively unthinking believer in the orthodox interpretation of the Cold War. Why did the Cold War happen? Because the dirty, rotten communists posed a threat to the United States, and it was incumbent upon us to mount a defense on our own behalf and on behalf of our allies, whether in Western Europe or in Asia. And as long as I was in the United States Army, that made sense to me. Not that I was thinking very deeply. So the Cold War ends, I get out of the Army. And the crucial thing here is, therefore, I moved away from an environment that, to put it mildly, did not encourage critical thinking, into an environment, as I became an academic, in which you were expected to think critically. And from that new perspective, the evidence looked different to me. I mean, I didn't become pro-communist, but I came to an appreciation of the Cold War that made it far more complicated. And as I suggested in my remarks, it seems to me that to indulge in kind of the simplistic notion of a Manichaean struggle of the good guys and the bad guys and the God-fearing and the godless simply does not convey truth, and perhaps more importantly, is not helpful to where we are today. So yeah, I pretty much changed my views of the Cold War profoundly. And that book that you referenced, American Empire, I suppose was my first, at length effort to redefine my own views. Is that okay?
That's great. Thank you.
No more women standing up at the mic, so we'll just continue with the predominantly male Q&A.
Thank you, Dr. Bacevich, for being here. Thank you especially for granting Tucker Carlson interview. You were on with him, and you were a voice of sanity.
I was horrible.
No,
I came home. I said, honey, how did I do?
Yeah.
She said, you were horrible.
Well, I don't know if you know him or you.
The day before my book's coming out. And I hate Fox News. I'm going on Fox News for a grand total of, I think, 3 minutes. And I blew it.
No,
anyway.
Sir, you were a breath of fresh air,
Okay.
as was Wesley Clark, who was on CNN, I believe.
What'd he say?
And that Iran is not a pushover, basically. That the history matters. The history shows that if you think they're just gonna, slink off after some, threat or something,
Right.
That but
I'm not a Wesley Clark fan, by the way. but
I
go ahead.
understand.
Yeah.
But I think because cable news is such a wasteland, if I didn't know it before, I knew it for the last 3 years.
Yes, and why did you let me go on then? Because the publicist says that's the way you sell books.
But no, it's critically important because that's what people take in,
Yeah.
by and large, all across the country.
Yeah.
And that's something that we haven't had. But what we have always had is the prevalence of secrecy,
Yes.
of complete and utter secrecy. But then once in a blue moon, the mask is lifted up a little bit, and I didn't know until today, there was an interview with Colin Powell after September 11th, actually just 5 days afterwards. And he said, when asked about Iran, he said, Hezbollah is a threat to the region because their support of Hezbollah, just as Al-Qaeda is a threat to the world. But he continued on, that's not what's important about the attacks. It's who we ultimately determined we should go against. In this interview, it was on CNN, he admitted they did not have proof. They did not have evidence. The evidence was leading, the proof was leading that Al-Qaeda and bin Laden were responsible. But when he did announce publicly that he was going to present those results,
You're going to want to come
he
to a
slumped
question mark here.
back and did not. Do you ever question that? Why are we not getting the truth, one, and why are we not demanding the truth, the evidence, before blindly
Okay, so we're
going
not. Why
into
are we not
these?
I'm going to say that your question is, why are we not getting the truth?
And,
okay.
and why are we accepting that?
Okay, two questions.
Too.
Okay. We're not getting the truth because people who are in positions of power want to be able to exercise power. And they bring to power a perspective, a viewpoint, to which they are committed, in which they believe. And when they are in power, they will do whatever is necessary in order to be able to try to pursue that vision. And I think the aftermath of 9/11 is a wonderfully illustrative example of that. I do not blame the neocons for everything that happened after 9/11. I do believe that there was prominent, particularly in the Republican Party, a conviction stemming in large part from this exaggerated confidence in American military power. A belief that the opportunity had presented itself for us to fix the Middle East so that the Middle East would not be a source of terrorist attacks on the United States. That ideally, if we pulled it off, the Middle East could be a place of nations that lived side by side in peace, embraced liberal values, and wouldn't be a problem anymore. And people in the Bush administration persuaded Bush that the so-called global war on terrorism provided the means to do that. They persuaded him that it made sense strategically to invade and occupy a country that had nothing to do with 9/11. And they thought they were being patriots. They thought they were doing good for the country. And the result, of course, was a debacle. Not simply a debacle in the sense that reconstituting a stable Iraq was a difficult task. It hasn't even happened to this date. But what they didn't appreciate is the extent to which the invasion of Iraq was going to itself be a source of instability that we're still dealing with. So that's the hubris, okay? And it seems to me that people, when they get to be in positions of power, they're somewhat susceptible to that kind of thinking. And it's easy for me to say, I'm just some guy who writes books, you know? I'm not Secretary of Defense. I don't think I'm called upon to, move history towards some destination. But I think it's a large part of the problem. We should let somebody else have a shot at this.
Thank you again.
Yes, ma'am.
Hi, Dr. Basovich. I've read many of your books, and what has always stood out in your talks and in the book is that you've always said that in being in academia, there was more environment for critical thinking. And I just wanted to push back on that a little bit because, as you know, we know some of the same people. My dad was in at Boston University also at one point. Richard Posner wrote a book called Public Intellectuals, and in it, the two themes he has is that there's been a lack of accountability in academia, and lack of quality control. And in my observation, I think there's some truth to that, you have the court intellectuals and you have, a smaller subset who are independent. And I think in your expose of in your books, what I took issue with was that you did also have an understanding, a conception of the bad guys, and I wasn't always so sure that you had the right bad guys, and I wondered whether you really believe that academia, higher education can redeem, fields like diplomacy and conflict resolution, which, are necessary, and whether it's really the government institutions themselves that have to go through radical change, and whether the higher education can facilitate.
Okay, so two answers to the question. First of all, I'm not trying to portray higher education as some kind of a utopian subsector of American society. I'm no longer in that world, but I read the articles about political correctness running amok in colleges and universities, and I sort of slap my head and say, how can that possibly be? Only thing I'm saying is that in my personal case, when I showed up at Boston University in 1998 and taught and worked in a very particular environment, for me it was utterly liberating.
Yeah, I see.
And nobody got in my way to tell me I should think in some way in order to conform to some preconceived notion of truth. And I will always be grateful for that. And then the second half of the question is the one that I've already forgotten, and you're going to have to remind me in like 6 words.
Well, the bad guys.
Oh, no. It was that whether or not somehow we can look to academe
Yes,
to
yeah,
redeem things.
Yes.
And the answer is no, right? I mean,
That's great.
No, but I mean, all, and this is not simply academics, but writers
Yeah, exactly.
and poets and filmmakers, people who are engaged in an effort to portray the truth, to speak the truth, to separate what's true from what's false. I think they make a vital contribution to society, but it doesn't mean everybody's going to listen to them. But I think that calling is essential and admirable as we, stumble along.
Okay.
Hi, Professor Bacevich. My name is Mike Duggan. In your book, America's War for the Greater Middle East, in the last chapter, you begin analyzing George Kennan's idea of containment, and beyond the stated goals and possibly met in the sense that we did dominate in the Cold War. You also say that it set up a condition of U.S. predominance in terms of disparities in the world towards our favor, in favor of the United States. That's the '69 Mustang you reference in the book. And you were a professor, and if you talk to young people in college these days, they hit upon the word disparities and privilege a lot. And a lot of them who follow environmental issues think that the world is dying at this point. The planet is dying environmentally, and that because
What do you think?
Yes,
Okay.
I think that it may not be too far to say, but we're like in a window, and it's got to be in the next. Reconfiguring the human relationship to nature within the next 20 years. Good luck with that. But they talk about how the West, and especially the United States, has benefited from these disparities, and that the world is dying, that we owe it to the poor people of the world that are on the receiving end of a lot of the changes from the environment to share in these resources as the
No,
planet
our
dies.
obligation is to make sure the planet doesn't die.
Right.
Our obligation is to try to ensure that this human project can continue and that we can somehow redress many of the mistakes we have made. That's going to require a profound change in the American way of life. Raise your hand if you think there is any serious collective support for changing the American way of life. Not just you individually, but all of our fellow citizens. And you are correct. There is no support whatsoever. So this is a very discouraging thing. There is now, I think, there is there's deniers on the extreme, but I think now there is a general recognition that climate change is A, real, and B, a looming threat to all of us. But there is no C, and C would be, and therefore we are going to gather ourselves together and we are going to address this problem with the same sort of force that we did when we took on the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese. We're just kind of slouching along. As somebody who's got young grandchildren, I find it very discouraging. But we should let somebody else ask a question.
One last thing. In regard to disparities, insofar as they do exist, would you say that there's a remedy for that, given how great the disparities are between the United States and external to it?
I don't know. It's probably way beyond my ability to say. I'm more concerned about the disparities within our country. We are indeed a very wealthy country. Where was I today? I lose track of where I was today. It was in New York. Before I was walking back to Penn Station to get the train to come down here. I do not remember ever seeing so many homeless people lying in the street, desperate, I'm sure with all kinds of illnesses that put them there. But they were numerous. And I have to say, I get a little bit more concerned about why can't we deal with that problem than whether or not we can solve the problem of poverty in sub-Saharan Africa. I actually think that we are called morally to address the problems that confront our fellow citizens before we deal with the rest of the world. But I was just struck by that. There were so many people lying in, I don't mean standing there, lying in the street, curled up in a fetal position. It was very disturbing.
Would you like to go ahead?
Yes, she should.
Yeah, but sir, can I come after her because I've been waiting?
Fair enough.
Thank you.
Thanks, Professor. This question kind of relates to your older book, the Breach of Trust book. Do you ever see a scenario in which something like national service or even a draft comes into being?
No.
And why not?
So this is a pet cause of mine. My conviction that the all-volunteer force is, A, ineffective. We don't achieve our political purposes, even though we're always at war. And B, undemocratic and, I think, immoral. So I am down on the all-volunteer force. I would like to see something like a program of national service. And to clarify for people who don't, sort of glom onto that phrase, national service means that everybody, age 18 or so, serves a period of time in service to community or country. And some people join the Marine Corps. And some people, work on Indian reservations where they have a terrible health system or educational system. Everybody serves. I think that would give us a more robust understanding of what it means to be a citizen. And is it going to happen? Not a chance in the world. Why not? Because we have become so comfortable with a definition of citizenship which is so thin and insipid, that guarantees me rights and privileges, but doesn't expect me to do anything except pay taxes, basically. And so I think that demands attention. Why doesn't it get attention? Because it's asking people to sacrifice. And it mandates sacrifice. And the 18-year-olds don't want to do that. They want to go to New York and have a good time. They want to go to college. And the parents of the 18-year-olds don't want to have that imposition be put on their kids. So it's a cry and shame that we can't even really have a serious, robust debate about national service. But it ain't going to happen as far as I can tell. But, as has already been alluded to, my basic outlook on life is gloom and doom. So it could be that I'm being a little bit pessimistic and actually something good will happen.
All right,
Yes,
thank
sir.
you.
Yeah. Thank you. By the way, it's a very interesting discussion. I'm interested in your opinion on two things. The first you'll probably agree with me or get close to it. If you look back in our history, it's in our DNA to do two things. We want people's land and we want access to their resources. So therefore, we start wars, we blame the victim, and we basically try to take away these things from them. We did Spanish, we did Native American, Mexican,
Go ahead,
the
continue.
Middle East, so forth and so forth.
Point number 2.
Okay. Point number 2, and you've started to address this, is this imbalance of wealth is at the core, both in our country and throughout the world. Now, if we're going to really survive, we need two things. We need
This is the second 2.
no, this
Okay.
this is my statement that I'm asking you
Okay,
to
all
answer
right.
to. Two things. One, we have to have the will to do it. And two, we have to have a systematic way to do it. At this current point, we have no organization to handle the population of both our country and the world. And where do we go from here?
Okay. I'm not even sure I can get to the second point, but the first point, yeah, the narrative of American history is a narrative of expansion. You know, you ask yourself, 1776, 13 little colonies become 13 little states. There they are, huddled together on the Atlantic seaboard. Fast forward to 1945. The United States of America is the richest and most powerful country on the planet. How did that happen? It happened because generations of American statesmen pursued policies of an opportunistic expansionism, meaning that whatever the opportunity was to acquire more territory,
Including
to acquire
war.
more to acquire more power, they seized it. And this is why I get so upset when people talk about the danger of isolationism. The United States of America has never been an isolationist country, comma, with the exception of perhaps 1938 to 1941, where isolationism was defined as a reluctance to intervene in the European war. Why were Americans reluctant to intervene in the European war? Because they had just done that 20 years before. With what results? We were roughly in the Great War for 18 months. 116,000 American dead. This at a time when the total population of our country was 1/3 what it is today. That is to say, if we fought a war with the same casualty rate today, over 18 months, we'd have 400,000 dead. That war was supposed to make the world safe for democracy. That war was supposed to make an end to war forever. It didn't do that. So to my way of thinking, it's kind of understandable that there were a substantial number of Americans in 1938 and 1939 who said, we don't want to do this again. That didn't make them pro-Nazis. It made them people who had had enough of war.
Sir, I was not talking about isolationism. I was talking about stealing other people's land and resources.
Okay, and that's what we did. Yeah, I mean, that's not the only thing we did. Sometimes we bought it, but we also stole it. Yes, I agree with that.
Many times over.
Yes.
Thank you.
Okay. I mean, on the other hand, I don't think we're ready to give California back to the Mexicans, are we? But yeah, we did. The Mexican War was a war of aggression. President Polk was insistent that he was going to bring California into the Union. He viewed that as absolutely essential to the continued rise of the United States, and he wasn't going to let anything get in the way of doing that. And he did. I'm not proud of that necessarily, but I don't see any strong movement on the part of our fellow citizens to, go back to the way it was. Yes, ma'am.
Sorry, we've got time for 3 more questions.
So you're not going to ask one of them?
No,
Okay.
I work here.
Because you could, because we're trying to do gender balance. Okay. Yes, sir.
Well, thanks so much for your talk. I just wanted to follow up and ask. It seems like an inevitable product of the American exceptionalism you're talking about is that we never have any shortage of things that we feel like we need to achieve abroad, and I'd hazard maybe even a habitual refusal or inability to prioritize between them. So I was just wondering if you could say, what do you think should be the top 2 to 3 ends of U.S. foreign policy, and how do we sell that vision to a foreign policy establishment and a broader public, especially if it requires a more honest reflection of the limits on how much we can reshape the world?
The way we do this is throwing our wholehearted support behind the Quincy Institute for Responsible State Policy, which stands for restraint and prudence and the avoidance of unnecessary wars. So get out your checkbooks. But you asked for what are my view of the 2 priorities? Priority number 1 is climate change. This is the common threat to us. It's the common threat to the planet, and it's one that we refuse to take seriously, and I think disaster awaits. The second priority, in my judgment, is to give up the notion that we are or ought to be the world's only superpower. That was very much, the fashion in the 1990s. Well, guess what? It was a bad idea then. It's simply an unsustainable idea now. We live and will continue to live in a multipolar order. We are going to have to learn to share the planet with other powerful nations that have their own interests. That is going to be a very, very difficult thing to do. But a military power is not going to oblige the Chinese to do things our way. So we have to begin to recognize the multipolarity and then ask ourselves, given the multipolarity, what ought to be the basis of our relations with these other countries so that we can learn to live in mutual coexistence? Not necessarily world peace, but just the avoidance of unnecessary conflicts would be a massive accomplishment that ought to be at the top of the agenda of our statesmen. Sir.
Yes, Santana. I must confess that I have a lot of admiration for your insights and your humor. And I'm going to buy your book. And not only that, but your previous book.
One down. Okay.
And some of the previous book, because apparently you have developed a line of thought that are quite interesting. I really like your position.
Thank you.
I imagine that there is no time to cover everything, but I felt the need to discuss a bit about the economic side behind all those things. Because we talk about ideas, and the ideas, bad ideas, good ideas, changing ideas, and it sounds like it happens out of the blue, and they don't. And so it's interesting to, let's say, put the different interests behind those ideas that you have so well analyzed. So that's my question. I mean, how do you see the economics behind those ideas sort of guiding or interfering or influencing those ideas?
So I'm like Elizabeth Warren. What are you laughing for? Who said, I am a capitalist. And that left everybody scratching their head because she's pretty far on the left. She is a capitalist. I'm a capitalist. I suspect that she and I agree that capitalism is the most efficient mechanism for creating wealth. But capitalism also is hostile to human values. Capitalism corrupts to a very large degree. The corruption that pervades our society stems directly from the practice of capitalism in our country. To me, the answer is not socialism, which I guess that's what Bernie Sanders has on offer. The answer is programs that will restrain capitalism to minimize the damage that the market does to human values while still enabling the creation of wealth. Maybe that makes me a liberal. Maybe that makes me as someone in the tradition of Franklin Roosevelt. I don't for a second pretend that there's 5 easy steps to getting it right. I think there's kind of constant pulling back and forth between the demands of the market and the demands of those who are being hurt by the market. But I do think that's the way to get at that. Yes, sir. I think you have the last question, sir.
You didn't mention it all, and I think it's important, is the military-industrial complex, which has constantly bombarded us with fears that we have to have a big military. With the end of the Cold War, they went searching around to some excuse. And let's face it, 9/11, the military-industrial complex had an orgasm over 9/11, because that was an excuse to keep that military big.
So I'll let you have the last word, which you just did. Okay? Hey, thank you so much for turning out. Let me speak on behalf of the bookstore owner. We only have one commitment so far. Only one commitment.
I want to thank the soldier and buy his book. There's only a handful of us who make these arguments.
Thank you very much.